Welcome, dear listeners, to this special Halloween episode of the Carolina Haints podcast, brought to you by Wreak Havoc Productions and A Darker World. I'm your host, Dan Sellers. As we've done every season of this show, we're going to bring you something that's a little different in honor of All Hallows Eve. But unlike previous years, I'm doing something different I've never done for any other episode of this show. I'm issuing a warning about the strong adult and graphic content that lies ahead. This is a disturbing true crime story that simply might be upsetting to some listeners of this show. You've been warned. October 31st, Halloween night, 1979. Shirley Lynette Ledford, a pretty 16-year-old, walks home alone from a Halloween party. She hears a car coming up the road behind her, and she playfully whips around, sticking out her thumb. She just has a short way to go. There's no need for her to hitch a ride, but she had a few drinks at the party, maybe a few too many. The car passes by without stopping. She giggles and continues walking. She doesn't notice the van in the parking lot across the street, or the man behind the wheel, watching her. She doesn't know that the man has given the van a nickname, Murder Mac. It sounds like the plot to a cheap 80s slasher film, but it isn't. The van slowly pulls out of the parking lot, stalking her. She doesn't hear it getting closer, so she is startled by the sound of gravel crunching under its wheels as it slows to a stop a few yards ahead of her. It's a silver cargo van with no distinguishing features. It only has two windows, the driver's side and the passenger's. The back is completely enclosed, except for the windowless sliding cargo door. As she walks past it, she hears the man call to her. "Hey, Shirley, do you need a ride?" How does he know her name? Is it one of her friends messing with her? Curious, she approaches the passenger window. She recognizes the driver. He's a regular at the restaurant where she works. Lucas, Liam, Lawrence? That's it. Lawrence, not Larry, he always says. "Do you need a ride?" he asks. She hesitates. He appears to be alone, but she can't see what or who is in the back. "I have weed," he says. She knows what that means. He wants her to relax enough to have sex with him. Why not? I mean, sure, he's old enough to be her father, but he always seemed nice at the restaurant. Besides, he wouldn't be her first. Opening the door, she wonders just how many drinks did she have at the party. She climbs in and immediately checks the back. They're alone. That's good. Lawrence pulls away and drives her to a dark, secluded area nearby. As he cuts the engine, she thinks she hears something outside. "What was that?" she asks. Lawrence just smiles. He pulls a small bag of marijuana from his pocket and crawls in the back of the van. She follows. There's a small mattress there. Typical, she thinks to herself. Other than the mattress, there isn't much in the van. Just a cooler and a toolbox. Lawrence reclines on the mattress, rolling a joint. She doesn't want to appear too easy. She sits on the cooler, bumping a coat hanger hanging on a hook inside the van. It scrapes out a metal-on-metal sound as it sways back and forth. She hears something bump against the outside of the van. "Are we alone?" she asks. Lawrence doesn't answer. The only thing she hears now is the metallic scrape of the coat hanger swaying back and forth. Shirley is suddenly nervous. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea. But then Lawrence leans in toward her and punches her in the face. Hard. It hurts. But she isn't going to be a victim. They struggle. She manages to get away from him, and she dives from the sliding door. The door to freedom. She jerks it open, prepared to scream like she's never screamed before. She jerks it open to find a man she's never seen before standing just outside the van. She jerks it open and is punched in the face again. She staggers back where Lawrence is waiting. He hits her on the back of the head with something heavy as the stranger climbs in and slams the door shut. The coat hanger scrapes back and forth against the van wall, and the last thought she has before losing consciousness is, now there's two of them. She awakes some time later. She sees Lawrence calmly pulling items out of the toolbox. A screwdriver, an ice pick, pliers, a couple hammers. The other man looms over her with a disturbing smile on his face. He's touching her. She's lying naked on the mattress, her hands and feet bound with duct tape. The stranger leans in with another piece of duct tape intended for her mouth. "No," Lawrence snaps. "I want to hear her." He looks her straight in the eyes. "I want you to scream." Before the night was over, Shirley finally got a chance to scream like she had never screamed before. It didn't do any good. Her body's found the next morning by a jogger, discarded on someone's front lawn like a spent cigarette butt. She's still bound and naked. The coat hanger has been wrapped around her neck and cinched tight with the pliers until it cut deep into her skin, strangling her. Her eyes are still open in defiance of what the two men had done to her. It sounds like the plot to a cheap horror film, but no Hollywood movie could capture the brutality of what happened to Shirley Ledford. In fact, the narrative you've just heard pales in comparison to the actual facts. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris met in prison, where they made a pact to commit a series of crimes that would earn them the title of the Toolbox Killers. Lawrence Bittaker was born in Pennsylvania in 1940. His parents had decided against having children, so as soon as their little accident was born, they abandoned him in a local orphanage without even giving him a name. He was adopted by Mr. and Mrs. George Bittaker. Lawrence's first arrest was at the age of 12 for shoplifting. He was arrested several more times over his teenage years for theft-related crimes. When he was 17, they moved to California for George Bittaker's job. There, Lawrence stole a car and, during the pursuit, also racked up hit-and-run and evading arrest charges. He was imprisoned at the California Youth Authority, but since he was underage when they arrested him, they released him when he turned 18. Upon release, he found that his adoptive parents had disowned him and moved out of the state. 4 days later, he was arrested for transporting a stolen vehicle across state lines. He was sentenced to 18 months, but was released in 1960 after having served half of his sentence. A few months later, he was arrested for robbery and sentenced to 15 years. He served 2. During this time, he underwent a psychiatric evaluation, which concluded that he was a borderline psychopath with concealed violent tendencies. And so the pattern continued. 1964, sentenced to 10 years, served 1. 1967, sentenced to 5 years, served 8 months. 1971, sentenced to 15 years, served 3. And just a few months after being released, Lawrence was arrested again in 1974, this time for stabbing a grocery store bag boy for accusing him of stealing. He was sentenced to 10 years at the California Men's Colony at San Luis Obispo. He was released in 3.5 years, but during that time, he befriended another inmate named Roy Norris. Roy Norris was a few years younger than Lawrence Bittaker. He was born in Colorado in 1948. Roy's mother was an addict, and he was repeatedly placed in foster care while she rehabbed. He claimed that many of those foster families neglected him, and some even abused him sexually. Apparently, this left an impression on Roy. When he was 16, he propositioned his 20-year-old cousin for sex. She rejected him, and even worse, she told her father. Roy's response was to steal his dad's car, drive into the mountains, and attempt suicide. He failed, and the authorities brought him back home. There, Roy's dad sat him and his sister down and told him that he didn't care. He didn't care if Roy slept with his cousin. He didn't care if Roy committed suicide. He just didn't care. And as soon as Roy was 18, he planned to divorce his mother and that he would be on his own. Well, Roy saved him the trouble. A few months later, he dropped out of school and joined the Navy. He was stationed in San Diego, where he spent most of his time doing heroin and pot. In 1970, he was arrested while attempting to rape one woman and suspected of 2 others. He was given a psychiatric exam and labeled a schizoid sex offender. This earned him an honorable discharge from the Navy due to psychological issues. The court released him on bail, and 2 months later, he propositioned a college student in San Diego State University. When she turned him down, he struck her in the back of the head with a rock, sat on her back, and repeatedly smashed her face into the sidewalk. He received a 5-year sentence, but because of his schizoid mental status, this was served at the state psychiatric hospital. He was released in 1975 when the doctors agreed that he posed, quote, no further danger to others, end quote. 3 months later, he raped another woman. This earned him a sentence at the California Men's Colony at San Luis Obispo. Within a year, Norris had become the primary drug dealer for his block in prison. That's how Roy Norris met Lawrence Bittaker. The two became good friends in prison, bonding over, quote, a common interest in sexual violence and misogyny, end quote, which was a little unusual since Lawrence had never been accused of a sex crime prior to this. Roy told Lawrence that it was the fear in the women's eyes that really did it for him, while Lawrence added that the victim should always be killed so there were no witnesses. More often than not, their conversations in prison consisted of plans to assault and murder teenage girls when they were released. Ultimately, this led to a pact between the two men to collect at least one girl for every teenage year, 13 to 19. Lawrence was released at the end of 1978 and kept a pretty low profile until Roy was released in February of 79. Together, they bought the silver van known as Murder Mac. Over the next few months, they picked up over 20 female hitchhikers. None of these women were harmed. They were practice runs. They used these episodes to work out what lines or rules worked the best to lure girls into the van. They also discovered a secluded fire road in the San Gabriel Mountains. The road was barricaded by a locked gate, but they broke the lock with a crowbar and replaced it with one of their own. The road was lined with deep ravines overgrown with dense brush. They were ready to begin. On June 24th, 1979, the two men abducted Lucinda Lynn Schaefer, age 16. They tried to lure her into the van, but she refused. Determined not to be denied, Lawrence pulled off the road about a block ahead of Lucinda. Then, Roy opened the sliding door and pretended to be having trouble with something inside the van. Lawrence quickly sped away, cranking the radio to cover her screams. Roy subdued the girl, binding her wrists and ankles with duct tape and gagging her. Lawrence quickly sped away, cranking the radio to cover her screams. Then they drove to the fire road in the mountains. Once they were there, Lawrence told Roy to take a walk. Roy left for about an hour while Lawrence raped Lucinda. When Roy returned, Lawrence did the same for him. In a statement he later gave to the police, Roy talked about how little struggle she put up. Quote, "She displayed a magnificent state of self-control and composed acceptance of the conditions of which she had no control. She shed no tears, offered no resistance, and expressed no great concern for her safety. I guess she knew what was coming." End quote. According to Roy, he argued against killing Lucinda, but he was the first to strangle her. He said he couldn't bring himself to do it, and stopped. Lawrence took over, strangling her until she passed out. Then he wrapped a coat hanger around her neck, twisting it tight with a pair of pliers to finish her off. They wrapped her in a shower curtain and threw her in one of the deep ravines lining the road. Lawrence assured Roy that the animals would take care of all the evidence. If Roy was squeamish about murder, he didn't let that stop him. They took their next victim just 2 weeks later. Andrea Joy Hall, age 18, was taken on July 8, 1979. They drove her to the same fire road where they each raped her twice. Roy then drove the van to the liquor store while Lawrence forced Andrea to walk up a game trail, naked. When he was satisfied they were in the right spot, he raped her again. Then he told her he was going to kill her, unless she could give him a good enough reason not to. Of course, he was never going to give her a reprieve. Instead, he took Polaroids of her while she begged for her life. Then, he shoved an ice pick into each of her ears and strangled her before kicking her down the ravine. They didn't kill anyone in August, but made up for it in September, when they saw Jackie Doris Gillum and Jacqueline Lee Lamp sitting at a bus stop. They offered the girls some smoke and a ride, both of which they accepted. Jacqueline was 15 years old. Jackie was only 13. When the girls noticed that Lawrence was driving in the opposite direction, they put up a struggle, but they too finally bound and gagged as Lawrence drove them to the San Gabriel Mountains. This time the men kept the girls for 2 days, repeatedly raping them. On the second day, Lawrence seemed to bore with just raping them. He told the girls that they should, quote, "feel free to express their pain," end quote. Then he stabbed them multiple times in the breast with the ice picks and tore out chunks of their skin with pliers. When the time came to move on, Roy claims that he argued against killing the girls, to which Lawrence replied, "But they only die once." Then he stabbed 13-year-old Jackie through the ear with an ice pick and strangled her to death. 15-year-old Jacqueline tried to run, but Roy hit her in the back of the head with a large hammer. Lawrence then strangled her as well. As the men searched the area and collected any evidence they may have left behind, Jacqueline woke up. Despite his claims that he didn't want to kill them, Roy repeatedly bashed her in the head with a hammer until he had. Again, they disposed of the bodies down a ravine. On September 27th and 30th, they attempted to abduct women but were unsuccessful. Later on the 30th, they managed to get Robin Robick into their van and raped her. They didn't kill Robin, but released her after the assault. And that brings us up to Shirley Lynette Ledford, our Halloween party girl from the beginning of the episode. And I told you that she didn't even come close to describing what Roy and Lawrence did to her. As you've heard, with the exception of Robin, the men had increased their brutality with each successive victim, progressing from sexual abuse to full-blown physical torture. Sadly, it gets worse from here. For some reason, they didn't take Shirley into the mountains. They drove around town with her in the back of the van for most of the night, taking turns raping her and torturing her. And even though her cries could be heard outside the van, they encouraged her to scream. This account, unlike the others, doesn't come from Roy's testimony against Lawrence, but from an audio tape that was found in the van, along with the Polaroids of the victims. Lawrence went first, punching her and ordering her to scream. She did, but he escalated to hitting her with a hammer. Then he also tore chunks of her skin out while he raped her and sodomized her. Roy described the constant screams that he heard coming from the back of the van. Quote, "We've all heard women scream in horror films. Still, we know that no one is really screaming. Why? Simply because an actress can't produce some sounds that convince us that something vile and heinous is happening. If you ever heard that tape, there is just no possible way you'd not begin crying and trembling. I doubt you could listen to more than a full 60 seconds of it." End quote. But then he switched places with Lawrence. He continued to treat Shirley with brutal violence. He also told her to scream while he was raping her. Her screams were not convincing to him without the pain to accompany them. So he picked up the hammer and struck her in the elbow. "You broke it," she cried. "I barely hit it." "Please don't hit me again." "No." And then he hit her 25 more times, all in the same elbow. The pain could be heard escalating as her cries turned into screams, turned to, quote, "an unintelligible mass of pain," end quote. To which Roy asked, "What are you sniveling about?" Roy noted that she didn't react very much when he twisted the coat hanger around her neck. She simply didn't have anything left. The autopsy revealed that she died of strangulation after receiving extensive blunt force trauma to the face, head, and breasts. When the audio tape was played at trial, Lawrence claimed that it was nothing more than the recording of a consensual threesome. During the playback of the tape, there was barely a dry eye in the room. Several people rushed out of the courtroom in distress. Lawrence Bittaker smiled. At the end of the tape, Roy begins to wrap the coat hanger around her throat. Shirley Ledford cries, "Finally, just kill me." Shortly after the death of Shirley Ledford, Roy bragged about the crime to a friend of his who turned him into the authorities. After a brief investigation, the police arrested both Lawrence and Roy. They searched the van and their residences. They found plenty of evidence against the two men, including the audio tape, the blood-stained tools, and several vials of acid. Lawrence calmly explained that they planned to use them on their next victim. The police also found Polaroids during their search. The pictures were not just of the 6 victims, but depicted hundreds of women. Many of these women were later identified and reported that the men had asked them to pose for pictures with them, but were not attacked. 19 of these women, however, had been reported as missing. Neither Lawrence nor Roy ever admitted to killing any of them. Due to the graphic nature of some of the pictures, investigators believe that at least some of these unidentified women had been killed by the men. In the end, the men were only charged with 5 counts of murder due to insufficient evidence. Roy agreed to testify against Lawrence in exchange for a promise that he would not receive the death penalty. As part of this agreement, Roy Norris pled guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of second-degree murder, 2 counts of rape, and 1 count of robbery. He was sentenced to 45 years at Donovan State Prison and was eligible for parole in 2009. Roy declined to appear at his 2009 parole hearing, which automatically deferred his eligibility another 10 years. He was denied parole in 2019 and died in prison last February. Lawrence was found guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 charge of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, 5 counts of kidnapping, 9 counts of rape, 2 counts of forcible oral copulation, 1 count of sodomy, and 3 counts of unlawful possession of a firearm. At his trial, 38 years ago, he received the death penalty, yet he remained in San Quentin State Prison until the day he died, in December of 2019. The audio tape of Shirley Ledford's murder is not easily accessible on the internet, but transcripts of it can readily be found. It is now used in FBI training exercises designed to desensitize recruits, quote, to the raw reality of torture and murder, end quote. If you're still with us, thanks for listening. If you're looking for more creepy episodes, I'd encourage you to go back and listen to the Halloween specials from the first 3 seasons. They're creepy fun, but decidedly less disturbing than this episode. This episode was researched and written by Jeffrey Cochran. It was produced and hosted by me, Dan Sellers. You can subscribe to the Carolina Hates podcast on iTunes, YouTube, Stitcher, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Every episode is also available at carolinahates.libsyn.com. You can learn more about this show and the upcoming Carolina Hates book at our website, carolinahates.com. Don't forget to like our official Facebook page at facebook.com/CarolinaHates. You can follow us on Instagram at Wreak Havoc Productions, and I'm on Twitter at Hang vs. the Undead. You can find everything Jeff's up to at darkerworld.com, and everything that I'm up to at wreakhavocproductions.com. Please take a minute to subscribe to this show, leave us a review, and share it with your friends. We hope you have a safe and fun Halloween. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. Tune in then to hear more about the things that go bump in the night.